Welcome back to the Radio Academy podcast. I'm your host, Georgie Jameson, and this week we talk about radio drama and find out the truth about Phyllis Twigg. Writer and radio historian Paul Carenza and audio producer from B7 Helen Quigley have worked on a new BBC Radio 4 drama about the very first radio drama, which had been all but erased from the history books until now. Paul has been researching Phyllis Twigg's story as part of his podcast, The British Broadcasting Century, and I asked him to tell me more about who Phyllis was and why was she important.
She began radio drama, and she is referenced in only, were this a visualised podcast, I'd hold up a book called The Story of Broadcasting by Arthur Burrows, who was the first voice of the BBC, first director of programmes, and he sort of was one of the people who had the idea for broadcasting, really. He was writing memos in the First World War about we could use this point-to-point radio thing to send entertainment to people's homes. And then 4 years later, he got his wish and the BBC began. So they're desperate for content that Christmas. They'd done news and music. And he mentions in his book that the first radio play, which was for children, was called The Truth About Father Christmas. And it was by Phyllis Twigg. And it was on Christmas Eve 1922. But that was pretty much all we knew because it wasn't recorded. The script didn't survive. So that was the little nutshell of information that we built this on, really.
I believe the manuscript and the recording of the actual play, they're lost then. What happened to them?
Well, they didn't record anything for the first 10 years of the BBC, so it's a lost decade, really. There was a script to begin with. The BBC didn't seem to keep a copy. Phyllis Twigg, we now know, did have a copy in her house, which was destroyed in the Blitz in the Second World War. And I've been looking for it ever since. It may be out there somewhere. But what we did discover then was actually she wrote a short story version under a pen name. And that's taken 100 years to find. So that was literally a year or two ago in the British Library. We sort of made this discovery that there was this short story version, same title, same author, different pen name she'd used, which is why it was difficult to track down. And based on that short story version, we thought maybe we could retell it for today's BBC radio drama audience.
Through your podcast, you researched her story, and I listened to that particular episode. You even found and spoke to her grandson, didn't you?
I should, at this point, mention Professor Tim Crook, a wonderful academic, and he's been a radio drama expert for decades. Because of the BBC centenary, we were both working at the same time separately on trying to find out who this Phyllis Twigg was, based on this little bit of information. We both separately then connected up her with her pen name of Moira Main. Tim got in touch with her family, who had no idea that actually Grandma was the inaugurator of radio drama, nor indeed that under her pen name, she also became the world's first TV chef. If nothing else, the fact that Tim and this tale, we've connected up this family with their ancestor has been a marvellous thing, let alone that we've now convinced today's BBC to take it on and tell the tale too. But the family knew nothing. They had all these books on the shelf, these cookbooks by a Moira Main, thinking she's a friend of the family. It's Grandma.
So that's the backstory. Let's talk about the radio play then that you've written that's going out on Christmas Eve on BBC Radio 4. The Truth About Phyllis Twigg. How did you go about dramatising this story, Paul, for radio?
Well, I should probably hand over to Helen, our wonderful director as well, who I would to say how we got in touch, actually. I think this is worth saying too, was we met in Chelmsford, birthplace of radio, pre-BBC. That's where radio sort of began, thanks to the Marconi Company. And I was doing a live show, I taught a live show called An Evening of Very Old Radio, when we tell some of these.
No, it was your previous one to that.
Oh, was it?
It was your Broadcasting First, the Birth of the BBC or something like that, wasn't it? No, the Battle for the BBC, that was it.
That was the ill-fated version when I actually tried playing characters and realised I couldn't act. But that was...
I can't remember that. Maybe that's for the best.
Probably for the best. So it was around the centenary time. We were talking then about how the BBC began, and I told this little tale about Phyllis Twigg and the fact she's gone uncredited for many years. And I sort of said from the stage, any radio producers in that can help us tell this tale, knowing that's always a long shot. And it turns out you've just got to keep saying that, because eventually there is a radio producer in.
Yeah.
And there was.
I already knew of Paul from his more comedian work, because I worked at Comedy Central many, many years back. And obviously being in Chelmsford as well, and having an interest in radio and having worked in radio for a long time, so let's go along to this, radio and comedy. This is very much my bag. And then he mentioned Phyllis, who, one, such a fabulous name. It's not one you forget in a hurry. And secondly, managed to trigger some righteous indignation about uncredited women in history. And the whole thing just immediately came across as a great story. I've said to Paul since, should we dramatise some of the others? And his argument was, maybe we should, I'm not trying to do you out of a job here, Paul, but their stories are complete. Phyllis's wasn't. There was still a job to do with Phyllis, and that's why we tackled it. But it's taken a while, hasn't it, it's been like 3 years, almost exactly 3 years since I first spoke to you to get to the point where it's on air.
Yeah, and during that time as well, and this is no besmirchment, if that is a word I've just invented, no besmirchment on today's BBC, but during that time, in 2024, they did a show or two crediting what they referred to as the first radio drama, which was Richard Hughes's Comedy of Danger in 1924. Little centenary event for that. And that was significant. It was the first original radio drama for an adult audience. If we found some history books that do they say things like, putting to one side Phyllis Twigg's The Truth About Father Christmas, the first radio drama was Richard Hughes's A Comedy of Danger in 1924. And I'm going, hang on, can we not put her to one side? How about we don't do that? Or put her to one side and we'll come back to her.
I've trawled the internet and looked in dictionaries, and nowhere does the definition of radio play or audio drama say not for children. There is no age limit or age restriction on drama. And people have said, is it a result of sexism? It's like, well, I'm sure it is. But as Paul has said, Arthur's book specifically says that the first radio play was The Truth About Father Christmas. A man, someone very important at the BBC at the time, one of 4 very important people at the BBC at the time, it specifically said in his own book it was the first radio play. So that leaving aside comment, again, got me annoyed.
It is annoying. And actually, Paul, you say on your podcast that the podcast has turned you into a feminist and a champion for forgotten women in broadcasting. Why do you think so many women's broadcasting stories have been lost?
Oh, there's a lot there, isn't there?
Yeah, there are several tales, aren't there, really? I mean, there's Phyllis Twigg is one of them, and the fact we've found a few threads we can pull on there is fantastic. And also, as Helen said, the unusual name helps as well. There was an early woman's producer at the BBC, again, early 1920s, called Ella Fitzgerald. Good luck in finding anything about Ella Fitzgerald online to do some research at her that doesn't link you to the jazz singer, So you need an unusual name. That helps as well. And also, I mean, one of the reasons I spent months trying to go on this quest to find more about Phyllis Twigg, and I drew a blank. I was looking for Phyllis Twigg, Phyllis M. Twigg, Phyllis Margaret Twigg, misspelling Phyllis, misspelling Twigg. It was only when I looked for her husband's initials, basically. You go on Ancestry.com, you see she was married to a G.W. Twigg. You search for Mrs. G.W. Twigg, so she's known by the husband's initials. And that then found this article in a newspaper that revealed her pen name, which then led us to the short story version. So it's been a bizarre quest, but hidden within that is that sense of historical misogyny, the fact that it was really, let's identify her by her husband's initials. And that's where she's been hiding in there all of that time.
There were a number of things that resulted in her being lost, and it was the name change, the patriarchy, history, the lack of a recording, the lack of a script. All of these things just coalesced into her falling off the map, essentially. But the clues were there all the time.
Helen, before you saw Paul in Chelmsford at this live show, were you aware of the story before?
Of Phyllis? No, not at that point. No. I mean, that was the most interesting thing. The number of firsts that did exist. The first DJ was another one, wasn't it, Paul? It was another one that came to mind, which was just a woman playing records for her husband.
Yeah.
At the other side of a field. It was like Gertrude. That was it, yeah.
Gertrude Donisthorpe, yeah, exactly. There are tales like that. Gertrude Donisthorpe in 1917, I think it was, field in Worcester. There's one of the, perhaps arguably the first, and it's very difficult when you start saying who was the first, because there's always a little version of it before, but arguably the first comedian on the BBC was a woman who did character act, almost like a Victoria Wood type act, Helena Millay. I think you could say she wrote the first original radio comedy performance. So again, lots of hidden women at the start, and it does seem to be then that once it gets a bit bigger, a lot of the men come along and go, oh yes, I think we know what to do here, thank you.
It was like brewing beer. The original people who made beer were women.
Yeah.
And the original chefs were women. And then it's just like the men come along and go, I like the look of that. I'm going to do that job.
So let's talk about your role then, Helen. I mean, the cast is amazing. How much did you and Paul work together when it came to casting?
A lot. I don't think I've worked quite as closely with a writer as I have done with Paul. There's been, there must be hundreds of emails going back and forth. There's so many of them. Yeah, initially having heard the story, spoken to Paul, did the usual thing of I went and talked to Andrew Mark Sewell, who I work with at B7 Media. We were the production company who pitched it into the BBC with Paul. The work from that point just was refining the first pitch, getting that through, then the second pitch, which is much longer when you need your story breakdown. And we already had cast in mind. I think Paul said to me, Rory Kinnear has to be Arthur. I've had him in mind for years. I mean, poor Rory, when we told him this, was a bit what? But and Tamsin Greig was another example of being earmarked for the role from the start because of her. Did you say Justice for Phyllis at the BBC Audio Drama Awards? Was that?
Yes, and I told her
that's how you get a job.
Exactly, and I mentioned it to her at the recording, and she'd forgotten completely, I'm sure. But it was the BBC. It was audio, one of the awards at the BBC, and she was presenting an award, and I think she'd been handed a bit of paper maybe that said Phyllis Twigg was apparently the first to do this. So she went, yes, well, 3 cheers for Phyllis. And someone happened to tweet that. I think it was Jeremy Mortimer happened to say Tamsin Greig has just asked for 3 cheers for Phyllis Twigg. And I'm the sort of, as a radio historian, I'm there literally looking on X, Twitter, whatever. If someone mentions Phyllis Twigg, I'm going to find out about it. And I sort of, found that name search. And then that led to that and go, Tamsin Greig. Yes.
We have co-opted the hashtag Justice for Phyllis, and we use that as much as we can.
I like it.
But I think she's got it now. I think certainly after the broadcast, we can say she's got it.
Christmas Eve will be all over social media with hashtag Justice for Phyllis as it goes out. Let's talk about the sound of it, the soundscaping and the music, Helen. Eloise Whitmore has done the soundscaping, and a lovely mutual friend of us all, Neil Brand, has done the original music. How do you pull all those elements together as the producer and take us back to 1922 via sound?
I think it was clear that we needed to have at least one other woman working on the project, and that should be the sound designer. And there really is no one better than Eloise at the moment for that kind of level of detail and attention to detail as well. So some of the street scenes and the recreations of the audio that she's done for the studio as it was, even though it wasn't a studio, it was a training cinema, just sound lovely, and gone away and recreated the Westminster chimes for it. And Neil, obviously I loved his sound of movie musicals, and even his podcast. I'm going to give his podcast a plug as well, because that's great, all about the music. I'd spoken to him in the past when I used to do trails for the BBC, and he came in to record a trail. And knowing he does the silent movie playing live piano for movies, 1920s. So I know it's an era he's fond of. Paul made the connection again, and I said, would you like to do this? And he did. He's done some lovely little themes and jaunty little bits and pieces that just evoke the era really nicely.
A drama, you say?
Yes, I don't know that your broadcasting reaches our little island, but a friend said that she heard you over the waves.
Oh, very good.
Asking for a children's drama.
Did I? Oh, no, I said that we were considering children's drama and so on. No, there was a comma, I'm sure.
Not an audible comma, I'm sure. If you're going to speak on the wireless, you must consider how to verbally punctuate.
No, I just thought we keep trying new innovations on the air. So, I thought perhaps a festive tale for the first British broadcasting Christmas.
Exactly. I sent you some stories.
Oh, you're that Phyllis Twigg.
It's really evocative sound when it comes to taking you back to a certain time, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I think he's done a cracking job. I really do. But one of the really fun and collaborative things I think about this project has been the way we've been able to sort of, I don't want to overdo the history side of things. And Helen occasionally has to rein me in and go, this is drama. This is fiction. We are allowed to fictionalize drama here. We don't need to be so, accurate about every little detail. But if it helps the story, then great. So one of the things was the actual house band they had, the 2LO Orchestra, they called it. You read history books, you might see, the 2LO Orchestra, and imagine an orchestra. But it's such a pokey little room, this first studio of the BBC at Marconi House, that it was an orchestra of 8. And the instruments were carefully chosen to make sure that they could all fit together. So, you probably couldn't really have the trombone at the same time as the violin because they'd poke each other in the eye. So
wasn't enough elbow room.
Exactly. I think there was a tale, actually. We've not included this because it's a different area, but I think the Manchester station, 2ZY of the BBC, when they had the trombonist, they had someone who would pull back the sheet so that, because it was like soundproofing, it was just an office really. And so you'd pull back the sheet, the trombone would go out, and then they could carry on. So you make it work.
There has been a little bit of dramatic license in place because obviously we didn't completely recreate the sound of a 1920s radio set because it would just be far too annoying and tinny and people would wonder what on earth was going on. We did take a few little liberties with the story, the main one being, and I don't think this is giving too much away, Phyllis wasn't in the studio for the broadcast. She was at home on the Isle of Wight listening, but we felt it would be more fun to have her in the studio. I think that is the main one. There's a few others where we've kind of slightly stretched or bent the truth to help, but It's pretty much as it happened.
I'd argue that we don't know where she was, because I've been looking for evidence and been working with Phyllis's great-granddaughter. I'm working on a biography with Phyllis with her great-granddaughter, Karina. She wrote loads. They went up, when they found out this story, they went up to the attic and found this shoebox, or loads of shoeboxes of notes and journals and letters, including one that Phyllis wrote to her grandson, said, "You're not born yet, but open this on your 21st birthday." And he's just opened it, aged 82. So it's taken a while. But we got there in the end. But looking through these things, I'm looking for evidence. Like, does she say she heard it? Does she say she was at home? Does she say she went to London, was in the studio? What we do know is that the short story version has Phyllis as a character in it. It has her daughter as a character in it, and it has Father Christmas telling these wonderful tales about the origins of Christmas and the history of it. And it's dreamlike, and all of these different ideas of scenery and things like that, which actually is another area, it's worth talking about, the fact that the Comedy of Danger from 1924 set in a coal mine, so you wouldn't have to imagine the scenery. But actually, this story has lots of interesting locations and time jumps and things like that. She's there in the story as a character. She never says in any of her writings that she was in the studio or at home, so we just don't know where she was.
We allowed ourselves to make the assumption that she's in the studio, yeah. Actually, one very important piece of information we completely missed is that in The Truth About Phyllis Twigg, the radio drama, Anne's great-granddaughter, Phyllis's great-great-granddaughter. So she was 8 at the time of recording, I think, playing her own great-grandmother.
That is something special. I like that. Let's talk about radio drama in general as a genre. This is a long-form drama, 45 minutes. We've recently lost the hour-long radio dramas. Could be considered a controversial move by Radio 3, but we'll put a pin in that because we're not here to talk about that particularly. But it does sort of inform this next question, which is, how do you see, both of you, the genre of radio drama evolving, particularly in an era of podcasts and audiobooks?
That's it. I think it already has. A lot of fiction drama, audio fiction, has moved into the podcast space because there just aren't as many commissioning or funding opportunities or platforms who are making audio drama. There's some really interesting and really great stuff coming out of the podcast community, the smaller indie podcast communities, but they're often unfunded or having to self-fund in order to make them. And I think there is room for some kind of crossover with the independent production companies like us, the individuals who are passionate about radio drama and audio drama, and then also for places like Audible, the BBC, Wondery, some of those to get on board a bit more with fiction. Now, I appreciate it's not the most lucrative way to make money when you've got easy to make entertainment and chat-based podcasts or branded podcasts, because those are easy to make, cheap to fund. But I definitely think there's a market for working together and possibly doing, and I have talked about this a couple of times, form of branded fiction. So you work with a brand to create a story relevant to their brand, not about their brand, because that's too in your face and too many people will be, I don't like being sold to in this manner. But it is entirely possible to make branded fiction in a way that would reach audiences in a way that perhaps commercials or chat-based podcasts don't.
Paul, what are your thoughts on this as someone who writes audio dramas?
Yeah, I write them and I listen to them a lot as well. It does need to keep evolving, I think, but because there are these different stakeholders in the industry, I think that automatically therefore happens. So Radio 4 they set out their stall, and podcasts and Noiser and Wondery can do their own thing. And as Helen's saying, for example, in docudrama, I contributed to one of the short history of podcasts for Noiser, and that was a very interesting way of retelling history via a soundscape. And audio, as we all know, we're all in the audio club, the audio world. Audio is brilliant. To do the similar thing in a visual medium, it would be incredibly expensive and take forever. But for audio, it's just so immersive and so wonderful. And those very ideas that I think really began 103 years ago with Phyllis Twigg's tale, we are still doing that today in so many different ways. There are countless stories to tell and countless different ways of doing it. And, the industry, of course, shifts a little in terms of where those outlets may be. We made a podcast for my podcast, The British Broadcasting Century. We recreated another radio drama a lot quicker than we could with the BBC, because we just had the idea, found some people, did it, and it felt immediate and like, wow, that's quite a quick turnaround. It's not got the same...
2 weeks. We did that in 2 weeks.
Instead of 3 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
But to compare, it was quite an interesting experiment to compare the two, both the Radio 4 version and this podcast version. We had two very different stories of early radio. There were no recordings, lost broadcasts. We recreated them, reenacted them. One, of course, has the depth, the soul and the budget and the cast of Radio 4. And one is just, you just make it happen. Let's do the show right here.
My thanks to Paul Carenza and Helen Quigley. The Truth About Phyllis Twigg is on BBC Radio 4 on Christmas Eve at 2:15 p.m. and on BBC Sounds. You can also find Paul's podcast, The British Broadcasting Century, on Podbeam and all major podcast platforms. We are seeking 2 new trustees to join our board. Expressions of interest are welcome from any member of the Radio Academy who would like to stand for election. Trustees oversee the strategy and direction of the Academy and have overall responsibility for the governance and financial security of the charity. To find out more, go to our website, radioacademy.org. Next week on the podcast, we look back at the best of the guests from 2025 with, amongst others, highlights from Fourth One's 50th birthday, FEMAC chatting about women in broadcasting, and previously unheard audio from TM Studios talking about sonic branding. I'll see you next week.